we have all three commissioners on here with us. And I don't think we need to run down the list of all attendees because as of now, it looks like we have over 60 people that are participating. So the way that if you all have any initial matters, let me know. Otherwise, I will go forward. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And stop me if we ever have any connectivity issues or if you cannot understand me or hear me. The way that I envisioned operating this conference would be first to go through the proposed amendments of the different filers. And I will attempt to share my screen. I've crested the half-century mark, so I'm not as adept with Microsoft Teams and sharing things on these things, but I'll do my best to pull those off, and then we will go through those, and I'll solicit comments from one, the filer, and two, from any of the other utilities or attachers or interested parties that might have something to say. I know that the time frame is weird on this. We have the holidays coming up. We had the proposed amendments filed just this past Monday. And so at the end of this, if people think that it would be useful to have written responses to those things, we can make accommodations for that as well. I also want to talk about some of the information that has been filed with regard to updating the whole attachment application numbers, as well as the document that Charter filed with us about future attachments. I believe that. So that's how we'll cap off our afternoon. Yeah, so we'll just take it from there. Does anybody have any questions? All right. The first comment that I'd like to talk, I'm going to take it kind of in order of shortest to longest. So it's Windstream's recommendation, and let's see if I can share a screen here. Let's see which one. I believe Windstream's recommendations to, hold on here. Can people see this document?
We can.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Probably call it a day with my success at doing that. All right. Here, Windstream wants to change the definition of attachment to exclude service drops. And as a basis for this, Windstream says that some service drops actually attach to more than one pole before they make it to the customer. First, I would like an explanation for those scenarios from Windstream. If anybody from Windstream is on here, can give me a scenario where that might be the case, where a service drop wouldn't just be from the closest pole, but might connect to more than one pole before it gets to the customer.
Certainly. This is Dan King. I'm in-house counsel with Windstream. Also got Jeremiah Stinson on with me, and so he can. I'll take it from just a sort of high level, and then he can talk more to the technical piece of it. But you might have a situation where, for example, I'll call it the mainline attachment, right? It's the main cable that we've attached to poles, and maybe it stops at a certain location, but we're trying to service a customer that may be 2, 3, 4 poles down, right? So we've not actually attached to those additional poles. We've not put our main attachment on there, but we do need to reach this additional customer. And so what we would be doing is we would be extending fiber through the service drop. So it's not like what we think of as a traditional service drop, right? Where the pole is right in front of the person's house. You just drop it from the pole, take it to the house. This person might be, like I said, 3 or 4 poles down. And so the main cable is not going to be on the pole, but what you have is a small fiber, your service drop fiber, that's being attached by J hooks and is going down several poles and then coming off of that pole into the residence. Jeremiah, from a technical perspective, is there anything to add to the way I described that?
No, Dan, you've got that summed up pretty well.
And so what we're finding, right, is we're finding that we're starting to see language that's coming up in the pole agreements where those, what I'm going to call an extended service drop, are being called attachments. They're being put under the same standards of attachments, which means you're going to go through the application process. And so we're traditionally, right, historically, a service drop has been something that the attacher has dropped the fiber off as a service drop. They provided notice on the back end to say, hey, we've attached this service drop and we've gone to this customer and given the pole owner notice of that. Now what we're talking about is going through the whole attachment process, right? So notice on the front end, there's evaluation. And so, we're having delays, right, that are going on there because now all of the standard application process applies to it. Whereas historically, it's just been a notice that's been delivered on the back end.
Okay, and is this something that is unique? I mean, not unique, but you see across all of Windstream's footprint, or is it something that's you see more in Kentucky, or how do other states just treat it differently than Kentucky does?
So, Jeremiah, I'd say, I mean, right now, specifically, we're seeing it in Kentucky. I've not necessarily seen that in other states yet. But Jeremiah has experienced it, in at least one situation or more than one?
That's correct, Dan. It's we have a few established agreements that exclude, but it's pretty well universal across Kentucky and Kentucky PSC regulated distributors now.
Well, also though, Windstream generally, is this something that's you see in your joint use agreements, or are you saying it when you approach a utility with whom you do not have a joint use agreement?
So I guess maybe the easiest way to answer that, it's not necessarily joint use agreements that we're seeing it, right? Because we've not, for example,
all three of us there, my husband, my daughter, and myself.
Don't think
All
that
right,
comment is intended to be included.
Somewhere I'm going to try to.
Yeah, that's fine. So what I would say is generally I think we're finding it more so with co-ops, municipal utilities. We've not necessarily seen that from, for example, let's say Kentucky Power, or any of the larger investor-owned utilities.
Okay, all right. I appreciate that. And I think Jeremy Gibson, did you have your hand up to speak?
Yes, Commissioner, I did. Thank you. I actually wanted to touch on this, and I don't know if this is the right time just yet, but to comment on this topic, but I definitely have some feedback on this specific issue that I'd like to put in.
Yeah, drop it. Let's go.
All right. So we have seen this across all of our jurisdictions, and as it's been described to us as the wave of the future from fiber companies. And what they're doing is they're trying, at least from what we have seen, to circumvent the permitting process by filing it under a service. And whereas service is defined in most agreements, if not all, and probably I think even with the FCC, I'd have to look at that again, but don't quote me on the FCC part, but most of our agreements state a service drop is going from the main line to directly to the customer, or from a main line to a single drop lift pole to get clearance over a street and then to a customer. What we have seen is these service drops, I'm using air quotes here, are running multiple poles. So they're not running out a main line all the way. So it's basically to, as it's been described to me, is to cut cost. So they don't have to run a main line all the way out. They have these taps now that they can stop a main line at, let's say, 15 poles short of where they need to go. and then they run these little service drop taps down multiple poles and using J hooks. So we don't allow J hooks on our poles. We don't even allow our internal fiber to use J hooks. So, and what we're explaining to customers is when you're running pole to pole to pole to pole, that is a mainline run. If you're claiming it's a service, that's fine, but it still needs to have a through bolt. It has to have messenger. It has to be permitted. You can't claim it as a service and run it down 10 poles just to circumvent having to run a main line out. So we're seeing it all over the place, and we're trying to stop it because it's turning into a mess in the field. And in fact, we had one municipality in Indiana call us on it because it got so bad. It looked like a bunch of spaghetti hanging up in the in the poles because there were so many of them. So, and in fact, that one customer we were dealing with, they ran upwards of 30,000 of these. They hit almost 30,000 poles, and then tried to come to us and say, "Oh, these are all just service drops." So, yet they had built out entire towns with what they were claiming are these services. So it can and will get messy if this kind of attachment continues to be labeled as just a service and not have to be permitted through the normal process. And we're finding violations all over the place on top of it too.
Hey, Jim. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody else about to.
Sorry, Eric. It was Tip, and you maybe, I'm not sure what you're going to say, but I was just going to second the concerns and the comments that were just made. And the electric cooperatives are having a very similar experience. I can appreciate that it's a cost savings measure for somebody trying to attach to the pole. It's a cost saving measure at the expense of reliability and safety. And it's creating, in some cases, loading issues, clearance issues. We're occasionally seeing things put into the electric space right over top of bands, clearly demarcating where that begins. It's fairly standard, I would say, in the industry to treat a service drop as the one drop off of the last pole, not across a number of poles. And so while I do appreciate the cost saving concern, it's not something that should rise above the safety and reliability of the system.
Yeah, Jeff, this is Eric Langley for LG, KU, and Kentucky Power. And I think we agree with pretty much everything that Jeremy and Tip just said. One thing I would add, though, is I don't think anybody disagrees that service drops ought to be treated differently than mainline attachments. I think the differences lie within the definition of a service drop. And so, for example, in LG&E's and KU's and Kentucky Power's tariffs, they actually define what a service drop is. And I believe in LG&E and KU's tariff, it is essentially a service line that runs from pole to premises or from a pole to a drop pole to premises. So it's kind of like a one pole secondary in the middle type of limit. Kentucky Power's rule, which I think is more clearly expressed in their policies that are incorporated by reference in their tariff, actually allow up to 3 poles. And so different utilities may have different specifications for that, but the heart of the concern is the same, and that is the more poles to which a service drop is attached, the more likely it is that there is a safety violation. And that's particularly true in the circumstance that that Windstream was describing earlier, where they are essentially using the service drop exception as a surrogate for permitting on primary poles. And so we think that not only has this issue already been resolved through the tariff submittals, but that that's where it should be resolved, not through revisions to the regulation.
Okay. How about other attachers besides Windstream? Charter, what is your experience with this?
Our experience is similar to that from a service drop would be from our main line to the actual residence and or business. Obviously in rural build, that distance is greater than in suburbia or in our metropolitan markets. And so we do see a longer pole grouping, if you will, in the rural expansion to get to an individual service address. But do treat that as a service drop. It is not our main line. It is not our fiber bundle. It is a single service drop to an individual residence or business.
Okay, and then how is that? I'm sorry, was I speaking over anybody? All right. So how, I mean, physically, how is a service drop different than quote unquote mainline run? Duke said that they require the same type of attachment to it. From the utility perspective, is it less of a load on a pole versus a main line, or is it the same? I'm just struggling with some of the concepts of this, and it might be we're putting too many angels on the head of a pin, but I kind of need to know a little bit more about the physical difference between a service or a mainline attachment.
So, Jeb, to speak to that, typically we would build a 48 strand fiber on a 1/4 inch EHS strand. The fiber drops we're using on J-hooks are approximately 20 times lighter than what the distributors are proposing we attach.
Is that kind of like the old coax drop or something? Because I'm thinking what Spectrum has, running to my house. It looks like the normal little coax. Is that kind of what it is for a service drop?
It's like that. It's even smaller. The fiber drop we use is 5 millimeters by 3 millimeters, weighs 9.7 pounds per 1,000 feet. I really don't see how loading comes in to be a concern with these.
I'd say that's consistent as well, right? So the size of that is significantly different than kind of the distribution of the main hard line, if you will.
I think additionally too, Jeremiah, and correct me if I'm wrong, we also have a self-imposed limit, right? So I understand, other pole owners' concerns, looking at some of the extremes of, 30,000 drops and, extending for multiple poles. We have a self-imposed limit of 1,500 feet. So we don't go beyond that. We would not have a problem, as we're, defining the sort of service drop, to have some sort of length limitation included with that would be reasonable.
Correct.
And we're consistent in that path, right? Our design has a limit as well, right? And because it's not running across multiple, it's simply going from that tap output to a singular customer.
Okay, and thank you for that explanation. I'm going to go to Mr. Jones here. He has his hand up, even though Jeremy Gibson has his hand up twice. Jason, I'll let you have a word.
Thank you, Mr. Penny. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I was just going to jump in here and say it's not really a loading issue per se. It's a safety issue here, right? So it doesn't matter what you're hanging up there. If you don't have proper clearance and you're getting into the power space, you have a potential safety issue, and that's our concern here. It's not so much the loading or the size of the cable that's being connected, or whether it's a J-hook or a bolted attachment. If somebody's in the power space, they run the risk of getting hurt, and that's our concern here.
Is this something that could be? Oh, sorry. I'm going to go to Mr. Gibson here. He has his hand up twice.
Thank you. So I'm number 2 in line is how that works in teams. So
let me believe what I want to believe. Okay.
Yes, sir. So I kind of somewhat disagree with Mr. Jones because it can be a loading issue. When you have multiple of these service drops running multiple poles and they're attached with J-hooks, and you get ice on these, they have a tendency with the pole to fluctuate with heat and cold. The J-hooks are going to pop out, and eventually those are things that are going to get snagged by trucks that pull lines down. Additionally, the J-hook, the service, again, if you have multiple of these, you got to account for every single one of those having ice on them. So it can be potentially a loading issue if there's enough of them. And during summer months, yeah, it probably doesn't weigh a whole lot, but you got to look at things from that perspective, the ice loading and things like that. So I'm trying to get a picture up here for you, Commissioner, to show you what this stuff looks like. I have some, and I'm glad to share that if my legal is okay. So it's kind of a mess to look at. And again, as I've mentioned, we've had complaints from municipalities about this stuff, and specifically questioning what we're allowing on our polls. And to be quite honest, we didn't know about this stuff until it started happening. So no one from a communication perspective has reached out to Duke Energy in advance to explain this type of build type. And I bet most of the utilities have probably had a similar experience with that.
So I'm fine, Jeremy,
If I
when you're
could,
showing the
Deb, just
picture, as long as there's
quickly.
nothing identifying in there.
Absolutely. Yeah, there would not be. So if I can find one, I'll pull that up here shortly.
Okay. I've stopped sharing the particular language. I don't think we need to have that up. So, all right. I cannot remember if any of this was discussed previously in the original discussions leading up to the regulations, or I can't recall. So I might have to refresh my memory on that. So, and I guess, and if somebody will explain to me, I think I know the answer. When an attacher overlashes, they're overlashing on their own facilities. They're not overlashing on another's facilities, are they?
They could be.
Yeah.
Okay, they could be.
You'd need to go to get the consent of the individual that owned the strand. But you're right. I mean, oftentimes the overlashing is in, on the attacher's own attachments, but it is possible to go and arrange to overlash we'll call it a third party's attachments.
I just didn't know if that's not mandated workaround, but a possible workaround on some of these times where you just file notice of an overlash and you can overlash on a third party's line, and then you can run a service drop from that. I'm just working through some scenarios here. So, all right. All right, Mr. Gibson, do you have an example of this? Did you find one? Because I'm thinking I want to move on from this topic, but
I'm looking, but yeah, I got to go through some old files. So I can bring that back up at a later time if need be.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
Chairman, my apologies. I did want to throw in one more comment on this topic, because I think one of the things that Mr. King was stating, where they have a 1,500-foot limit, I think there are scenarios where in that instance, there are some instances where we would probably be okay with it. And in those scenarios, the specific thing I'm talking about is if they're running down a country road and you have one customer that sits down a long driveway that's got 4 or 5 poles that feed that house, and they're the only customer back there. I think in that instance, it would make sense to run just a service drop back there, because they're only feeding one customer. So, and it's only going 4 or 5 poles in that aspect. But to the point of where you have 4 or 5 poles that might feed 10 customers, that's different. Does that make sense?
I understand that, and I think Ms. Day was the one that discussed that you don't have this scenario so much in the more urban areas. It's more common in the rural areas. Am I putting words in your mouth? Or did you say that?
No, you're right, Mr. Penny. And I think that's typically the description. And as you kind of described as too, Mr. Gibson, is that you're going from that tap. Think of that easement at the roadway where it meets the driveway. And those additional poles, as Mr. King described, right, are going to that residence down, typically alongside their own private driveway. But it could be, in a rural scenario, a 1,400-foot driveway.
And I'll add the electric cooperative perspective. I mean, clearly you can have scenarios where something is longer, but the fact of the matter remains, you still got to have to attach to those poles, and there's a permitting process to ensure the safety and reliability to make sure that happens. And so there may be some one-off scenario where something can be worked out or whatever, but I don't know that that's something that needs to be approaching the substance of regulation.
Okay. All right.
And I do have a picture up if you're ready to look at this. So that now I will tell you, this is an extreme circumstance that I found, but this highlights what could potentially be. So that's why I want to make sure I'm clear on what we're getting ready to look at.
All right, well, share away.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yep, we got
Yes.
it.
Okay. These are all service drops attached to J hooks. Nothing's lashed. It's all just sitting there. Now think about if there was ice and all that. That's where it would become a major loading issue. But again, this is an extreme circumstance, but this is what we could potentially see with a lot more communication companies claiming this is the wave of the future. This is the, the type of builds they want to do. This runs probably 20 poles and throughout this entire city. This is one of the ones where we had a major complaint on. But there are other scenarios where you might have up to 5 or 10. Some customers have claimed they even have 12 of these at times running off a tap. So they might stop on this pole and come down this direction, 10 more poles to feed 10 customers. So, and all this stuff is just flailing in the wind. Nothing's lashed. These are all J hooked. Very easy to pop out, especially with that many services on there. So, again, this is what you're looking at, and it's not a pretty sight. But these were also all done without permitting as well, stating they're just service drops. So
Okay, so I appreciate you sharing that. I still have 2 hands up. Looks like Jason Jones, you still have a hand up according to Teams. Do you still wish to speak?
No, sir. I'm sorry. I did not realize it was still up.
That's okay. So that leaves one more hand up to speak. Mr. Stinson, do you still wish to speak?
Yeah, I'd just like to provide some final commentary before we move on from this. In regards to ice loading, the cross-sectional area of the proposed fiber drops is approximately 27 times less than what the distributors are proposing we build out. So I'm not really seeing that as a concern. We also won't have instances where we have the 10 drops on a span. This is more of a rural issue, as a couple of people had referenced, and that is actually where we're seeing these issues come in, is with rural customers. This represents a approximate 25% cost savings for us in rural markets, and of course that's not just the cost savings, that's a time and deployment savings as well.
All righty. Yeah, thank you very much. Any last discussion on this topic before we move on? All right. Thank you. Give me a second while I shuffle my papers. All right. Give me 1 second. I'll pull this up. Let's see. Okay, I'm intending to share Duke Energy's comments. Can people see that?
Yes.
All right. Here, I think that Duke shares some concerns with or comments with LG&E, KU, and Kentucky Power's comments, focusing on the reprioritization of applications. And by and large, while I'm reading this, Duke has recommended just doing away with the ability to reprioritize applications. So any of the utilities, feel free to comment on this. I believe LG&E and KU said that at least to their knowledge, nobody has utilized these provisions. But Duke, since you were talking about it first from your perspective, have you had any issues with this, with reprioritization? Has it caused any consternation or hold up in processing of applications?
Absolutely. Every build we've ever had that has had a prioritization list has turned into nothing short of a nightmare. I think I mentioned on one of the previous calls, we had a customer that was demanding a priority list, and a year into the project, they had to scrap it and start over from scratch because they could not manage it going in and out. So additionally, another scenario I mentioned on a previous call was where in another jurisdiction, we had one company that, and I think this is the case with most customers right now, have a RDOF and then a business as usual division. So, and in that jurisdiction with our one contract, their company was broken up into 3 different jurisdictions, and each one of those jurisdictions had an RDOF and a BAU. So there were 6 different divisions to try and prioritize, and none of them were talking internally. So we had each division coming to us saying, we want this priority, we want this priority, and neither of them knew the other was asking for it. So it turned into, it created a lot of issues with our permits in just that one area, even with a small amount of priority that we were asked to look at. So again, I in doing this stuff for 15 years now, anytime I've ever attempted to work a priority list, it fails.
All right. LG, KU, Kentucky Power, your experience. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Mike, I'll get to you in 1 second. I saw your hand up. I'm going to hear from LG and KU, since I think they've made the similar recommendation.
Yeah, this is Eric Langley. We have made a similar recommendation, and as you might recall, and I think most of the people on this meeting will recall, we opposed this rule in the proceeding last spring and early summer when the commission was considering adding this to the emergency reg. We questioned whether, not so much whether there would ever be appropriate times to reprioritize, but whether this needed to be a regulatory right. And I think the fact that nobody has exercised this regulatory right in the 6 months that it's been available, it speaks volumes about whether or not it is necessary within the reg. And so we'd like to see it deleted.
All right. Mr. Schwanek, your hand's up.
Yeah, good morning. And I'll let others from the field team at Charter jump in here. But I guess I'm now prompted to react to this comment, to this issue, Jeb, a little bit more broadly, which is and this is reflected in the document that I think we filed that we're going to talk about later. I think there needs to be a sensitivity and a recognition to what we're going to be dealing with and what we're dealing with right now in terms of value. And to make a comment like, well, something hasn't been used and therefore we're going to take it off the table, I think is not an appropriate way to look at this. There has been considerable build. There is an active amount of build that will be increasing in the near term. And that is only going to accelerate and grow in the coming years. And so as an attacher that has a lot of commitments and a lot of deadlines in terms of state and federal grants, this was something that we had previously asked for. We think it has value. We don't think it's being abused. And I heard some comments earlier about kind of concerns about this being abused. We're not aware of any concerns operationally with this in Kentucky. And I'll let Heather speak to that further, but we're not aware of any pole owner coming back to us on this particular issue and saying this is problematic in terms of Charter's conduct in the state. I'll let you, Heather, add to that, please.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right. Thank you,
absolutely.
Mike. Hold on, Heather, wait 1 second. I do want to remind everybody, if you're not speaking, please put your computer or your telephone on mute. I'm getting a little bit of background noise, and I appreciate that. All right, go ahead, Heather.
Absolutely. So to Mike's point is that where we have utilized the prioritization, and I think as Mr. Gibson had articulated, is really outside of the Commonwealth. And so within Kentucky, we have had great success partnering with both the co-ops as well as KU on how we both either submit and or identify those priorities. We talk about contingencies in terms of the ready to attach population, where we may be waiting on make ready from one pole owner and other things to finish out a build. And so we've got to have an opportunity to be able to utilize the structure of that reprioritization to ensure that we meet the deadlines enforced kind of by the states in each of the local areas relative to the rural build process. And to Mike's point, right, the population of round 2 is greater than that of round 1, and we expect B to be even greater than those populations. And so being able to prioritize so that we can construct broadband timely across the Commonwealth is critically important.
Yeah, and going back to Mike's comment, I think I discussed this in one of the previous meetings, is that the commission wasn't in really a well-informed or a sufficiently informed position to make amendments to the regulation in the first place. The commission was back in June when the commission did it. The legislature told the commission to make these amendments, and so we usually in these proceedings we try to gather as much evidence and see how things are actually affecting things, and we're just short of that right now. So I acknowledge that while nobody's has used, or at least in KU and LG&E's experience, Kentucky Powers hasn't really utilized the reprioritization, the volume of applications is going to increase. So, we'll see. All right, Mr. Gifford, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that prioritization becomes much less of an issue if the pole owners are meeting or exceeding the timelines. I think that's probably why KU has seen fewer reprioritizations, is the high volume agreement has worked fairly well, right? So if things are getting done, you in general don't need to reprioritize as new projects come in.
So is that, I take that you support everything should be a special contract? I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
No, I do not.
I know. Sorry, a little humor on this day. It's Friday the 13th. I'm not going to tempt too much fate. All right, Mr. Langley, you have your hand up.
Yeah, the point I was going to make is that I don't think we're saying that there's never a good time or an appropriate time to reprioritize. We do think, as I think Tracy was suggesting, that is most appropriate in the context of a special contract. And in fact, that is happening between KU and Charter within the special contract. But if we are talking about this, really high volume of applications covered by the reg itself, this reprioritization rule becomes even potentially more problematic. It wouldn't be nearly as problematic if the regulatory timelines only covered a narrow sliver, like 500 or 1,000 polls in any 30-day period. It's that expansion of the regulatory timeline that has us worried about the consequences of this, especially when these are consequences that, for the most part, can be avoided through good planning and prioritization prior to submission.
All right. Anybody have any more comments on this? Or no, actually, I see two hands. Sorry, Heather, you're first.
Yes, I do, Mr. Penny. So I think the one thing to keep in mind is the volume that we have in our rural build out plans, right, amongst all of the counties that we're trying to build out in Kentucky, is that traditional business continues, right? New businesses are created, other opportunities, right? New homes are built. And so when that happens, we need to be able to service those customers. We've had full planning of all of our rural build and have executed those in the proper order. However, life continues on, and I think that's just one piece to keep in mind. When a new subdivision may be built, those may cross into those other pole owners. And so it's not by way of poor planning, it's simply a change, right? And so we've got to have regulations that account and enable us to be able to continue with traditional business as usual while we also work through the rule execution.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Day. Mr. Giver, you had your hand up, but you took it down.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add to what Heather was saying, that the reprioritization is being painted as a mismanagement on the front end, and at least in our case, that is not the case. We get additional grants that have a shorter timeline and therefore drive a change in our priorities, right? So what we need the ability to do, whether it's under a special contract, and if it works under a special contract, it will absolutely work under regulation. So we need the ability to change priorities driven by the priorities of the state in this case, or the Commonwealth.
Okay. And then Mr. Schwanek, you had your hand up. You wish to speak? All right. Okay. I appreciate your all's comments on that. And knocks out a topic of conversation for later down the line. All right, let's look at, I think Duke had one other recommendation, and that's when we're talking about negotiating a special contract and what triggers the ability for a attacher to file a complaint with the commission on not being able to meet a special contract. Duke has proposed to increase that from 15 business days to 30 business days from the time a written request is made to engage with the attacher. Then the attacher could file a complaint with the commission. Any comments on this? For this, Duke, have you? I'll elicit comments from Duke first. Have you had any problems with this? Because to my knowledge, the commission's not been faced with has not received any complaints from an attacher.
No, we have not. In fact, we're in negotiations on a plan like this right now, and it's a month and a half in, and it's a good negotiation. It's going well. I've never seen anything being negotiated within 15 days. It just seems like a very short period of time to negotiate a contract. So that's why we're just asking for 30 days. I can't imagine that the communications would disagree with this, knowing that it does take some time to negotiate these things.
Attachers, I'm looking at y'all.
I don't see any concern with the extension of 15 to 30.
All righty. That sounds good. Okay, so that knocks out the comments of Duke Energy. Give me a second to share screen while I look for the cooperatives. Bear with me. Let's see here. Is that it? I found it. Okay, so I'm putting words in lots of people's mouths, but it seems to me that the two main issues here that the cooperatives have brought up are timely payment, and then appears to be the holding of making the payment on make ready estimates for different applications, making the payments all at once, and it triggers the make ready deadlines. So I welcome the cooperatives to speak to their proposed amendments.
Thank you. This is Tip. So a few thoughts here. One, I think our perspective prior to this, and even as of today, is that the regulation that we've got in place is generally workable, which is why we've kept our suggestions to a pretty bare minimum. The principal issue that we are encountering is getting paid. And I don't know that I have a complete understanding of why that is, but it continues today. And so what we propose to do, I know there are mechanisms in the tariff, but to perhaps make it clearer from an operational perspective to everyone involved, to insert some suggestions suggestions to the regulation that before make ready begins, all the invoices incurred prior to that, make ready estimates and actual invoice work for surveying and that sort of stuff, need to be paid. And I think it's essentially that black and white on that front. So that's part one. Part two is related to that second change, which is when these estimates and all these things are out to the attacher, what we're experiencing is a large amount of these will accumulate beyond the 14-day period after which the estimates are withdrawn. And what's happening is if you've got, 250 applications or permits sitting out there, they're past that, and then there's a payment to cover all of them at one time, it kind of creates a logjam to then start the clock and get all of that worked. And so what we're proposing to do in the spirit of cooperation is when that happens, when these payments come in after the fact and we've got that logjam scenario, just the parties need to sit down and negotiate in good faith to appropriately address the way that's going to be deployed and worked. Because at the end of the day, we do want the broadband in our community. We just need to be able to manage it in a way that's possible. And the problem we've had is that the requests and the permits and the go order, the action order, is not coming in until it's not being smoothed through the process. So we'd like to try and find a way to kind of level that out across time.
Okay, all right. So now to any of the attachers, what would you like to say about this?
Sure, Mr. Penny, I'll take that. And so from a payment perspective, and also in the spirit of partnership, we would absolutely and feel that we do partner well with each of the cooperatives along with the IOUs. And so you'll see even in some of the data stuff that we've provided that I think it shows like 542 polls that are the total amongst all co-ops that show a past due make ready. I would also point out that about 70% of those, over 300, are honestly just an all-in-one update. They were paid in August and November prior to the data being updated. So we want to make sure that we are good stewards, both from that partnership and payment. We do not expect make-ready construction to commence until we have paid the make-ready estimate. And so but many of the make-ready estimates that may come back may be all on the same job. We talked last month where we may need to go back and seek funding for some of those jobs and things like that to ensure that that's the same pathway we're going to take. Would we pivot to underground? Will we find an alternate path? And what would we do? And that isn't intended to create any type of bottleneck. It is simply to say, what is the best path forward given the make-ready estimates that we've received? And some of our builds, most of them, frankly, require make-ready estimates from multiple poll owners. And so we have to gather that data and collect it together. So we agree from a partnership perspective. I think we have had individual conversations to ensure all payments are both paid timely as well as properly invoiced to us and within the tools and systems that we are collectively using.
So you still would not be in favor of a prepayment prior to, so let me see what I'm saying is that what exactly is the payment that the RECCs are proposing to get beforehand? Let me clarify that.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
So which payment is it? The payment for the estimate for the cost of the make ready work, or is it what payment or would the RECCs propose be paid? I guess just work me through it. What is the fundamental change that the RECCs are proposing here?
And Sean, you may need to jump in at some point on the specifics of this, but at a conceptual level, so you've got your survey costs ahead of the make ready costs. That can be done either as an estimate or it can be done on actuals. And then when the make ready begins, there will be an estimate for that make ready. So both of those categories of costs would need to be paid ahead of the commencement of the make ready work. Now, to the extent your question goes to what are we experiencing, I think it's sort of all of the above, Sean, but I don't know if you have details on that.
Yes. So I would say what you just described, Tip, is accurate, right? And so the issue becomes, as Heather said, they need to evaluate make ready estimates, and sometimes those make-ready estimates do influence what they're going to do. In some cases, they're going to go underground or choose a different route. And so that, I would say, is our chief concern with the prepayment issue, Mr. Penny, is those things actually do change. And it prevents the co-ops from, for example, starting construction before they receive payment, because then they're at risk of a change. It also, I think, really complicates the idea of making a prepayment because the attacher may rightfully change their mind on what they're going to do. So unfortunately, I think the system that we have is somewhat necessary. Right? We need to offer the cost and then allow the attachers to decide that they accept the cost and they want to proceed. And that does it does create a bottleneck, and it does, in our experience, is creating a bit of a tidal wave of everything. Even if everything works on time, if it takes some time to get inputs from other pole owners, if it takes some time to decide to go underground or to stay the course, what you end up with is lots of these things being paid at once. And then, since that, well, we haven't been doing any pole change outs for 2 months while we waited on decisions, and now we have all the decisions at the same time, and we have to do all the pole change out at once, for example, just creates operational lumpiness, for lack of a better term.
And I think recognizing that the attacher is taking additional time, has the luxury of taking the time they need to make those decisions, just reflecting that on the pole owner's side, that requires additional work in response to that. And if they have the time, the pole owner should have the time as well. And that's where the second part of the proposal comes from, in terms of negotiating good faith to get those worked in a manner that achieves both parties' objectives.
And if I could add, so to the second piece that we've been talking about, you may have, as Tip said, multiple applications that come in over the course of weeks and months. So they all have their different timelines. But if there's a log jam and we're waiting on a response on a make-ready estimate, and then that response comes in for several applications at one time, well, all of a sudden, those several applications that came in over the course of weeks and months have the same make-ready deadline. That's the problem, and that's why we're looking for the ability to negotiate there with the attachers on the timelines. But I also want to get back to the first issue, which is what payment is it that we're looking for before the co-ops are required to commence make-ready. So it's the make-ready estimate that we've been talking about, but it's also the survey costs and the engineering fees. And Sean or Tyler, maybe you can weigh in, but I think a lot of the outstanding payments that the co-ops are owed are for these engineering fees that are part of the survey costs. So we want to make sure those are paid before the co-ops have to commence make-ready.
Okay, and so the proposal, the way I read it, is that all the survey, the engineering fees, as well as the make ready estimate should be paid before things begin. But what about splitting it? Say at least the survey and the engineering fees have to be paid before the make ready can commence or the timelines commence. Is there a little wiggle room if the commission decides to take a look at this?
Well, we need to have the make-ready estimate paid ahead of time to begin that work. I mean, that's in some cases,
that's right.
It's expensive.
Yeah, that's my bad. Yeah. Okay,
Again,
I understood. All right, Ms. Day, you have your hand up.
I do, yeah. So I just wanted to kind of echo there. We agree on the make-ready estimate to be paid up front, and that's what we are doing to date. To date, just year to date alone in Kentucky, we've prepaid $31 million in make-ready just for pole work, right? Prior to any subsidy work, that's what Charter fronts up front in addition to the remainder of the build process itself. So we want to work through with that. The intention is not for any type of log jam there. And if we need to discuss the invoicing side of any of the others, if that is done as part of the make-ready estimate, and then we can kind of work through that versus it being a follow-up and or a true-up, right? But we would just need to coordinate that and understand that timeline there.
Okay. And Mr. Stinson, you also have your hand up.
Yeah, Jeb, I'd just like to provide some commentary on the engineering and survey fees. We have been advised by a third-party engineering firm co-ops are using now that if they are going to provide the engineering and make-ready fees as part of the make-ready invoice, that is going to delay attachment approvals significantly.
Did they say why?
No, they provided no insight to that. It's an email from a couple weeks back, and it's also something that had come up in the annual attachment meeting, is they're billing separately for engineering and surveying, but they're coming back after the fact. I've requested this on the front end to be included in our capital expenditure for these projects, and they've advised to provide that on the front end is going to increase time frame for approval.
I need, could you specify who they is again? I apologize.
So specifically, this is McLean Engineering through Fleming Mason for this
Okay.
request.
Well, as luck would have it, they are here.
We're happy to address the question. I think the question is, so typically, if it's a proactive survey fee, we can build that on a unit basis. It's very quantitative. It can be billed in advance. If it's a sort of reactive review, it's hard to quantify that, and that's typically billed on an hourly basis. And so that's billed in response to what we received from the attachment request. So I think that's the issue is we typically bill in arrears for hourly work because it's done as a reaction, as a review of what's been submitted. So we can, we do bill that on an ongoing basis. I'm not familiar with the specific email, but I'm happy to review it with you and go through it. I'm not sure that I agree with the perspective that would delay the process. In no way does our work wait on getting paid. We don't delay the process at any point for doing hourly work or unit-based work in advance.
Okay. All right. Well, any other comments on this topic? Okay. At this moment, we have three other things to discuss. It'll be the proposed comments of charter or the KBCA, proposed comments of KU, LG&E, Kentucky Power, and then to discuss the updates and the I guess the prognostication of future attachments. So this might be a good opportunity to break for a good 15 minutes so people can stretch their legs and get some coffee or whatnot. Why don't we come back here at 11:20 and just propose to reconvene then, and maybe we can just put our heads down and get through with the rest of this. Does that sound all right? All right. See you all back in a few. Okay, so we're back. Yay. I'm sure everybody's excited. Wait, my mic was on. I apologize for that too. All right, so let's keep it with the utilities comments first. Let me see if I can pull up the IOUs attachments. Give me a second. Let me find it. That's not it. Fair. Okay, all right. Here we go. Can everybody see it? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and recommend or suggest that the commissioners probably are not going to take the advice of KU and LG&E and Kentucky Power to just simply let the emergency regulation lapse. So I do appreciate that they did point out several of the sections that are worth keeping. The web address, clearly identify payments, all those things. These sections, which I'm highlighting here, do all participants agree that these are elements worth keeping from the emergency amendments? Or does anybody disagree and that we should get rid of these things? Mike, Schwanek, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I guess, Jeb, just for clarity, so that we're not kind of unnecessarily commenting, I guess we were operating on the basis, and Todd, please check me on this, that absent us seeking a change, that the provisions of the emergency regs would be retained. And I'm not sure if I'm being articulate on that point. Todd, do you understand what I'm saying?
No, that's
Yeah,
consistent with sort of my understanding in terms of our recommendations that we put in our document and our submission were changes to what you had sent out, Jeb, in terms of the red line of the regulation. So that if we didn't propose a change, that we supported that consistency going forward.
Yeah, and that's my assumption. I'm just saying that I don't think that I do appreciate the KU and LG's comments that the original regulation was the process of a long, drawn out process. I was there for it, so I appreciate that. But I'm just saying that I anticipate the commission will not simply just let the emergency regulation lapse. I just want to put that out there and address that. But with regard to what I'm showing here, just these sections, I assume that everybody have these amendments to the pole attachment regulation proven to be useful. Have certain of the amendments that we've made been useful in, I mean, we talk about things that we want to change, but this might be a good opportunity to say, like, did some of the changes the commission made in the emergency amendments, has that proven useful in processing and speeding up applications?
Hold back now.
Yeah.
Well, Jed, I think
All
one
right,
of the
well-
reasons for silence is that there's been very minimal utilization of the emergency reg, which kind of funnels into, the point that you said the commission was unlikely to accept, and that is merely reverting to the original regulation that was the result of a very lengthy process and a detailed record with full participation. But the main element of that, and the main concern that I think was expressed specifically by KU, but also joined by LG&E and Kentucky Power, is that if the emergency regulation had been in place a year or a year and a half ago, Charter and KU likely would not have entered into a special contract, and Charter's deployment would have gone nowhere because there wouldn't have been the resources there to actually get the deployment moving. And that is why we think that going back to the original reg, or even better, sending even more deployments to the special contract model, is actually the most pro broadband deployment approach that the commission could take. We're not saying this because it's easier on us or it's lighter on us. We're saying it because we think that it works. And it's certainly the only model that's proven to work in Kentucky.
All right, Mr. Schwanek, you have your hand up first, then Mr.
Yeah,
Werner.
and I'll be brief because others are gonna. I guess I just want to comment or offer a perspective on our view of the world, which is, for those of us who have been on this collective journey now for more than 12 months, right? I think the reason that we're all here today, and that the commission had meetings, and that there were emergency regs, and that there was a resolution in the legislature, was because I'll call them the permanent regs were not sufficient, right? Otherwise, none of us would be here today with all of this process and all of these steps. And I'm not being critical of anybody. We've all, I think, been working hard and have been acting in good faith. But I agree with the general comment that the emergency regs have not been fully tested. I think that's a fair statement, right? And I think that's not because people are not because they don't matter, but because the circumstances are what they are, right? It's been a short time period. By the time you kind of ramp up and execute on them, there are challenges there. And a lot of the positive outcomes that we've been seeing is a reflection, Jeb, of managing the backlog, right? That preceded the emergency regs kicking in June, right? So we're kind of managing applications that were already in flight. So they wouldn't have lended themselves to being processed under the emergency regs because they were already in process, right? So I would just kind of caution that I think the question is, what is the baseline assumption? And I think our baseline assumption is that the emergency regs are the floor and not the ceiling, right? And I think others would say, well, we should go back to the regs that existed before. I think in our mind, not only are the emergency regs helpful, but we feel like other changes should be implemented to improve the process further.
Okay. All right. And then Mr. Warner.
Yeah, sure. Just to layer on a few points. One, as Mike said, it's really too early to tell how well the emergency regulations are going to work and are working, given where we are. And as Mike said, things are in flight. So I think it's a bit premature to assess, and certainly unfair to base or see in any silence a recognition that the emergency regulations aren't necessary. I think it's just basically too early to tell. And in terms of the timing, the special contract was agreed to prior to the emergency regulations, and from our perspective was really a response to the fact that the regulations prior to the emergency regulations were not really working. So again, I don't think that the emergency regulations, or we can judge now them not to be useful. I think it's really just too early to tell. Thank you.
Mr. Gifford, I think you popped up as if you wanted to say something.
Yeah, Mr. Warner covered most of it, but I did want to say that the KU model is not the only one that has worked. Both Shelby Energy and Fleming Mason have done great work in doing it, and it was against the backdrop of the emergency regulation, I think, that motivated them to open the lines of communication and start the process of finding a way forward, right? So I do believe that the correct regulations that are set up to handle the volume of poll applications that are coming, it is very important.
Okay. And how many, if you know off the top of your head, how many polls were we looking at in Shelby or the Fleming Mason runs?
I don't, sir. I don't have that in front of me.
Don't worry.
I would have to.
I don't need it.
I would have to lean on Heather. She has some of that data.
I was just wondering, like, what milestones were triggered in terms of the timing and all the 500, 1,000, 1,500, et cetera, polls. That's all I was asking. So I don't need to know. That's just my moment of curiosity. It's past. I don't need to know it. So
just a rough guess, I would say probably, but those two combined are in the ballpark of what we started with KU. But again, that's a guess.
I won't hold you to it. Mr. Langley, you're up.
Well, I'll let the co-op speak to whether it was the original reg or the emergency reg that motivated the success in that deployment. I actually tend to agree somewhat with the point that Mr. Warner made, that it may indeed be too early to know whether the emergency reg can be useful or not. But it's not too early to know that the special contract has been successful. And that's why we continue to lean in to that being the appropriate model.
I appreciate that. And I know I sound like a broken record, but bad facts make bad law. We would not have been at this point of making emergency amendments unless we'd been directed by the General Assembly. And so we might have been at a point where we had to make changes, and we weren't anywhere close to consensus as possibly we could be. And the way that KRS Chapter 13A works, that regulation is only in place for 270 days upon filing, and then it will go away. And so the commission is in a position to have to do something. And, that's not to say that further amendments couldn't be made once the BEAD money starts flowing in. Whoever knows what other money starts going. We're going to talk about the projected rollouts after this, but a lot of this is just going to be best guess, and there's always the opportunities to change it in the future. So I take note, and I agree with both Mr. Langley and Werner that it may not have been long enough to actually know if the regular regulation had worked before people started complaining about backlogs of attachments, because a lot of the I remember that I think there was a project in Scott County that started before the original regulation was in place. So, that's enough of my soapbox. Let's just go forward. But I'm saying that what the commission files in February will not be the end of this either. So we'll take a look at it. All right. So let's look at, I think, something that is very intriguing is the I'm going to call them IOUs, stands for investor-owned utilities. The IOUs proposal to delete the definitions of complex make-ready and simple make-ready and use just an enhanced one-touch make-ready framework. So I invite the IOUs, maybe Mr. Langley or whoever, to give us an overview in your decision to propose this.
Thanks, Jed. This is something that I think everybody in this meeting has probably heard before, but it's what we refer to as enhanced one-touch make-ready. And I know that it looks like there's a lot of red line in our proposed revision, but the red line really falls into three categories. One of them is the enhanced one-touch make-ready. The other is steering more deployments to the special contract model. And then the third category is what I'll call odds and ends, like 4 or 5 revisions that don't fall into either of those categories. The removal of the definitions of complex make-ready and simple make-ready are both part of the suggestion to move towards enhanced one-touch make-ready. And what we're proposing here is something that, it seems like it would benefit an entity like Charter that has a lot of money flowing into it from the grants and that is looking to perform on large deployments. Because what it would do is it would not only give Charter the right, but also put on them the obligation to perform all CommSpace make-ready, whether it's simple or complex. So it would be the commission giving Charter that right to go ahead and do it all without having to issue a notice, or without the utility having to issue a notice to the existing attachers and them waiting 30 days, 45 days, whatever that time period is, to exercise self-help. It would cut through all of that and go and give Charter the right to immediately, after Power Space make-ready is complete, to go out and do everything they need to do in the CommSpace and to install their attachment. When we talk about ways to expedite broadband deployment, I think this has got to be at the top of the list, because it completely eliminates the sequential waiting periods associated with the existing framework within the CommSpace.
All right. So what say you attachers? Ms. Day, you have your hand up first.
I do. So from an attacher perspective, this is something that we would consider as potential, but we would absolutely not want to see this as mandatory. We would not want any other attachers to move and or touch our Charter plant as it's connected to customers. And there's just a very inherent and high risk that if something were to happen, we could actually either have those lines damaged and not be able to rectify them quickly enough, and or cause customers to lose internet service, inclusive of businesses who would be losing revenue. So we absolutely would not support a mandatory single touch here to where anyone else could move our plant.
Right. And hold on here while I finish that thing. Mr. Tatura, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Penny. Matt Datura, CTIA, the Wireless Association. Just noting, here, the simple complex make-ready definition is, similar to what Heather said. It would have a pretty significant impact on our members. Our members, obviously, any wireless attachments are currently within the realm of complex make-ready. We have had the chance to discuss the amendments a little, but haven't had a chance to get everybody on the same page yet, just this late in the year. But I can tell you, I think my guess is there are going to be some pretty significant concerns with eliminating that distinction, which and again, I'd have to go back to look at the FCC proceeding where they came up with this distinction, but there was a pretty decent record built on why there should be two types of make ready here. And I know there's going to be concern among my members if again, Charter et al. Would be just moving our wireless attachments without our people there. So that's all.
Well, but if we're
Let me ask you
serious,
this: go ahead, Mr. Langley.
I mean, I hear what Heather and Matt are saying, but if we're serious about things that will promote broadband deployment, I mean, all stakeholders are going to have to make some sacrifices. It shouldn't just be heaping further burden, administrative, operational, on utilities. The attaching entities are going to have to accept some of this. Now, of course, your Charter would love this when they're the ones deploying. It's when it's their facility that is being jeopardized that they raise the concern. But the commission has a rule that requires already that complex work in the comm space be performed by a qualified contractor, and we're proposing to retain that. So any of the work that would be performed in the comm space would under our proposal be performed by a contractor that meets the requirements and the definition of the commission's regulation. And I believe it's section 5.2, open paren 2, close paren.
And Mr. Langley, I know that I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that you cover more than you can cover pole attachment issues in more than just Kentucky. Let me ask you this: are you aware of any other states that have that allow this enhanced one-touch make ready?
No, we're on the vanguard, and honestly, Kentucky has been on the vanguard in a lot of ways, which is why we're urging that Kentucky consider this. A group of utilities that includes AEP is currently advocating for this approach in the FCC, but that rulemaking proceeding is ongoing.
All right. Yeah, I've seen some FCC proceedings take a long time. I think there might still be some old section. I can't even remember what some of the sections were dealing with the 96 Act and interconnection. So I'm not going to dive into there. Mr. Gifford, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Mr. Langley would recommend that we allow folks to move and or rearrange our plant, but the power companies aren't willing to do the same with theirs, right? They has to be done by an approved contractor and under special contract. And look, I'm sure that he's assuming that this is distribution and that cutting a fiber would while you're resplicing would only impact one customer or a few customers. But in many cases, this could affect interstate traffic. There's more traffic on a fiber than just a simple internet packet to one customer, right? So even if you have the skills to splice fiber, you don't have the network knowledge to know what impact you're going to have when you cut that fiber, right? So there's just no way that we could agree to allow complex make ready within the Charter network. You could cause major national impacting outages.
Well, this is really just a timing issue though, because other attaching entities have that right already. The only difference now is they have to wait 30 days for Charter not to do the work before they can exercise it.
Not for complex make ready.
No, that is true for complex make ready. Under the current rule, once the notification has been sent, if the comm space attacher doesn't perform within whatever the time period is, 30 days, 45 days, then the new applicant has the right to perform that work using a qualified contractor. I mean, that's the whole,
I believe
that's the whole
that, I
deal of
believe that's
self-help.
simple make ready. I'll have to check. I'm not an attorney, but I believe that's only for simple make ready. And we do respond, and that's the reason we respond.
And to Mr. Gifford's point of, you're absolutely right. We don't let, and we're not going to let anybody touch our electric lines because electric has the potential to kill. Fiber does not. Last time I checked.
See, I'm looking at the regulation. It says one touch make ready option. Say make ready. You know what? Let's go back and talk what's before us. I will, I think, invite probably written responses within the next few weeks on these comments, just so people can flesh out their arguments a little bit better and have it on the record. So I think Mr. Datura, you have your hand up.
Sure, and again, I don't want to belabor it if we're going to go to written comments, but I'd note that, if we're going to allow wireless attachments to be moved here based on a standard of qualified contractors that KPC is proposing, I would also note that, KPC is generally getting the final say in what constitutes a qualified contractor here. And right now, if, the qualified contractor list is limited to simple make ready, they're not touching wireless attachments, okay, but you're going to need somebody who's going to, let's say, for sake of argument, that you were to adopt such a elimination of this distinction, we would at a bare minimum want say on the contractor list for who could be moving these. And right now the utilities have that power to say yes or no and set the standards at this point. So just something else to think about.
That's a good point, and that's something that we can talk about and that could be added to the reg. If the comms wants to have a say in who those contractors are that perform the work that we're talking about, I don't think the utilities would object to that.
All righty. Well, thank you all. Let's keep this ship a sailing, and let's go on to talking about overlashing. And I think this will also touch on probably some issues that KBCA brought up with regard to notice of overlashing. So, Mr. Langley, would you want to kind of give a little overview of this proposed change?
Sure, and before I do, yellow, we color coded this just so it'd be easier for people to read. The things that are color coded in yellow fall outside those two major buckets that I mentioned earlier. So orange, if it's color coded in orange, it's part of enhanced one touch make ready. If it's color coded in blue, it's part of the revisions to steer more deployments to the special contract model. If it's in yellow, it's something else. So on overlashing, under the current rule, their utilities can require up to 30 days advance notice of overlashing. That's been the rule since 2021, when the commission adopted the original regulation and addressed why it was 30 and not 15 days in its statement of consideration. The only tweak that we're proposing here is that the number of polls be tied to that period. So for example, that 30-day period covers X amount of polls, because right now, the way the rule reads, it could be 1 or it could be 10,000. And so we just like there to be some connectivity between the time period and the volume. Because we do think overlashing is important. We recognize that there's going to be more of it.
I think the cooperatives would echo that. Simply, raise the idea that it may be possible that that could be dealt with in the definition of an overlash by limiting the number of things in that, so that we protect the safety of the system.
All right. So KBCA had a different approach. They didn't propose any sort of limit on it. They also proposed a 15-day time frame rather than 30 to mimic the SEC's time frame. So I'm welcome anybody from KBCA. I think Mr. Werner, you have your hand up, so why don't you have the first bite at it?
Sure. Just briefly, we obviously take a diametrically opposed view on overlashing and the commission's promotion of it. We do not think there should be any cap on overlashing, and that the timeline should really be expedited. It shouldn't be 30 days. It should be 15. Many states allow 15. The FCC's never imposed any sort of poll cap on overlashing, and that's consistent with the way overlashing has been critical to the rollout of broadband facilities on a timely and cost-effective way. So we don't think the commission should be imposing any sort of limitation on that. Oh, and the FCC also is, of course, 15 days. One of the things that we put in our comments, of course, one of the themes that runs through the KBCA comments are that the commission should continue to align its regulations overall with the FCC's well-considered approaches on all of these issues.
Yeah, the FCC rule is 15 days, and it was in 2021 when the commission decided to go with 30 rather than 15. And I think it was well considered then, and it still is.
All righty. So let me ask you, I mean, is this a concern for the future, or is this a current concern that there have been situations where there's been a notice of overlashing for a large number of polls and it's caused some consternation, or is it something that's anticipated to occur?
I think it's both, because there are a good number of overlash notifications that come in, but we also believe, and I think Charter would agree with this, that there are going to be more in the future. But I'd like to pull in Jason, John, and Mark Feeney, and also Jeremy Gibson if he has feedback on the volume question.
Well, this is Mark with AEP. In Kentucky, we haven't seen a lot of it coming in just yet for overlap, but in our other territories, we have been seeing a lot more being proposed and attached. So it is on the rise, to Eric's point, but that's just within the AEP footprint.
Okay. All right. I'm ready to move on. And so I believe that the next one is that the IOUs want to basically delete the right of the attachers to perform a survey for, what is it, 500 or fewer polls. Eric, could you speak to that, please?
You're muted, Eric.
And you might want to unmute.
I thought I was talking loud enough that it could push through that. This change here is similar, maybe even identical to an issue that we raised prior to the adoption of the emergency reg, because we didn't see a point to this, nor did we see how it actually resulted in faster deployment. In fact, the concern we raised is that it would have the opposite effect by slowing deployment because of surveys that were performed incorrectly. I think the term that we used then and that we used in our comments filed earlier this week is that surveys are a single point of failure in the process. And while it's true that there's an existing self-help right if the utility doesn't get it done correctly, until that happens, there's no need for this rule. And granted, it's only been 6 months, but for LG&E, KU, and Kentucky Power, they have not seen a single instance in which this right has been exercised. I don't know if Duke has or not, or if the co-ops have.
Nothing from Duke.
Okay. So from an attacher's perspective, does this provide any value allowing an attacher to perform a survey for fewer than 500 polls? Honestly, this was the proposal from the previous chairman of the commission, so I didn't get a chance to pick his brain about why he suggested putting this in here. So, but from the attachers, does it provide any benefit? Mr. Warner, your hand's up.
Yes, it does. And of course, this is an issue that we've been discussing for a very long time in these informal sessions. The reason why, I think from the attacher's perspective, it doesn't matter who does a survey as long as it gets done timely. And the importance of the right for the attachers to do it themselves is to ensure that it gets done on a timely basis. And I'll stop there, but ask our field folks to weigh in on the practical implication of the rule and how it's worked for us so far.
Yeah, I can jump in, Paul. And I think, Mr. Penny and team, that's exactly how it was described, is that having that opportunity and flexibility is when the timetable exceeds, right, what is doable both by regulation, but also kind of an operational practice where we've had to step in historically in that space.
And Mr. Gifford?
Yeah, Heather's got it exactly right. The only time we have to use this is when the poll owner is unable to complete surveys in a timely manner.
Well, respectfully, that right already exists under self-help. This is different than self-help. This is the right prior to the expiration of any period to submit a survey upon which the utility is presumably required to rely. We have no objection to the self-help rule. We get it that sometimes we're not going to get it done and that there needs to be a self-help rule. This provision of the reg applies before the expiration of any time period.
Okay. All right. Any final discussion on this till we move on to the next thing?
I had a question. Is this, Mr. Penny, is this section specifies that they have to use an approved contractor or the utility, correct?
They
can't just use any company off the
I believe
street that
so.
they-
I think it does have to be an approved contractor.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. So next one, Mr. Langley, you want to speak to the incremental extension of completeness review for timeline for larger orders? Is this just part of, you want to steer everything towards a special contract?
Or steer more things towards a special contract, or really we'd be satisfied, as I said earlier, with just going back to the original reg. We thought that was the right balance. But if there are going to be further amendments, we think the right approach is to send even more deployments to the special contract. And so everything that is highlighted in blue, and this covers a good number of the comments that follow, are part of that broader suggestion.
Right. And these are, I think these are probably identical to the issues to a lot of the discussion that we had over the emergency amendments. I am not trying to be rude, but would you accept it on faith that I understand the arguments from both sides on this issue and that we can go on to the next thing? All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right. We also talked about the right to reprioritize pending applications, extended survey times for larger orders. So how about talking about the provision regarding the one-touch make-ready surveys, Mr. Langley?
That is just part of the enhanced one-touch make-ready proposal.
So a change necessary if the commission were to adopt the enhanced OTMR, that it would have to make a change to this section too.
That's right. It's one idea, but it touches 15 different places of the reg. And so that's why, it's a simple concept, but to actually align the regulation mechanically with the concept, it required, a seemingly large number of revisions.
Okay. All right. Let's see. This is the same thing here because it's blue and yellow. Blue, I'm just going to skip over because I think I understand what those changes are. Same thing with the yellow or goldenrod color.
It is, but one thing that I would add to that is I think that in KBCA's comments, they are suggesting that the incremental periods, both on completeness review and for survey and make ready, are confusing and hard to administer. And I mean, I think there's actually some overlap in the parties' thinking on that issue. I will say that if the commission were to revert to the original regulation, it would be much simpler because there would only be two time periods. There'd be the regular sized orders, and then there'd be the larger orders up to 1,000 polls, from 300 to 1,000 or whatever it was. So, I mean, I know that the parties are coming at that, but the stakeholders are coming at that from different perspectives, but there is that piece of overlap on this issue of the ease of tracking and administration. So I'll just point that out for, you know, consideration and further conversation. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, Mr. Langley. But if we make them easy to read, the attorneys will not have a job. So we're going to do our best.
There's always other work, Jeff. There's always other work.
All right, that seems fair. And we'll talk about some of those changes. I think that a lot of these things probably touch to the thing. All right, so revise the self-help remedies. That's different. What are you proposing here, Mr. Langley? On page 11 of your comments. Yeah.
Yes. What we are proposing here is, and I think this is something the attachers would get on board with, is that we would have the right to waive the waiting period in essence. And so, for example, the survey period, let's say it's 45 days based on whatever volume of applications has been submitted. If we know on day 2 or on day 1 that we're not going to be able to do it, we'd like to be able to say, we hereby waive the 45-day period and you can move forward with self-help. Same would be true for Make Ready, although I think it's far less likely it would occur in that instance. It's in essence allowing us to shorten the time frame before an attaching entity can exercise its right to self-help.
And is there something similar, at least something that touches on that, Mr. Warner or Mike Schwanek or Mr. Oslo and KBCA's requirements that said that there has to be some sort of notice requirement? Like if a utility knows there's not going to be certain requirements or certain stages, I can't remember where exactly it was, but am I correct in that a utility should be able to or should be required to tell the attacher that?
Yes, we do touch on that in our comments. I think it's the last comment that we make in our comments. So we do ask for advance notice, and I think we are. Others will correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think we generally are aligned that, of course, the earlier notification we get, the better when it comes to exercising our right for self-help.
Okay, and so the proposed change in the regulation, Mr. Langley, would allow a utility to do that? Do you think that the current regulation prohibits the utility from waiving that? Is that why they make the proposed change?
Well, we're concerned that that's the case. I think there's an argument that we possibly could, but we'd like that right to be expressed in there. So I think the only real conceptual difference between what KBCA is proposing and what we're proposing is the permissive versus the mandatory nature of waiving that period. And we think it should be permissive because we may believe on day 5 that we will be able to do this, and it's only on day 27 that we realize there's no way we're going to be able to do this.
Okay, and so how would, I'm just going to kind of jump forward to KBCA's proposed solution to this notification. How would the KBCA envision their proposed change taking effect? Like what obligation does it put on the utility?
I think from our perspective, and we outline this in our proposed comments, it just would require them to provide notice as soon as they know if they're not going to be able to perform the Make Ready.
Okay. All right. So and what would be the utility's objection to having to provide such notice? Because as you said, Mr. Langley, it's like at day 5, you think you might be able to do it, but then on day 27, you suddenly realize that would be, it's that you can't.
I think if the obligation is truly keyed off of when we in good faith understand that to be the case, that's possibly something that we could work with. It's not something that I've discussed with the utilities, but that would more closely align with the point that we're making in our proposed revision. My understanding, though, of what KBCA proposed is that they were asking the utility to declare within 15 days of the submittal of an application whether we were going to be able to meet the survey deadline, and even more complex, whether we were going to be able to meet the make-ready deadline. Of course, there's no way we would be able to know whether we could meet the make-ready deadline without having already performed the survey, because it's the survey that speaks to what type of make-ready is required, what the volume of that make-ready is. But on the survey piece, I think that there is some sort of like happy compromise here that could potentially satisfy the concerns or the needs of both parties or of both stakeholders.
I'm quite happy to hear that might be some common ground to be found. All right, we can address that in written comments. I appreciate that. All right, let's talk about the approved and qualified contractor sections, what the companies are proposing here.
These were in the nature of cleaning up some potential ambiguities on what types of contractors were required for certain types of self-help. So from an electric utilities perspective, the only time that the contractor must be an approved contractor, in other words, a Section 5.1 contractor, somebody on our list, is when it is a survey of an electric utility pole or when it is power space make ready. It doesn't need to be an approved contractor when it is CommSpace make ready. Now, if the communications companies feel like they need a larger voice in who qualifies as a Section 5.2 contractor, I think that's a conversation that the utilities are open to having, because we don't designate approved contractors for those purposes. So our proposed revisions are really just clarifying that when it's an electric utility pole, the survey has to be performed by an approved contractor, and the power space make ready has to be performed by an approved contractor. But anything else can be a mere qualified contractor under Section 5.2.
And so, I mean, that proposal, would that, you think, assist in the processing of applications or of attachments? And I welcome comments from either Mr. Langley or anybody else in this group. Ms. Day, would that make things a little bit easier on the attacher?
I think it's something we would need to take back to review.
Okay. All right. Like I said, I apologize for the timing of a lot of this. We get this, just a few weeks before what for most people is a holiday season when they're, off from work. But that's, this is kind of the time that we had to work with. So we'll take it. Same thing with the qualified contractor, Ms. Langley. I assume that ties in with the previous one, addition to the qualified contractor requirement. Okay.
Yes.
All right. I think we've gotten through the company's comments. Any further discussion on these issues before we move on to KBCA's comments? All right. There being none, I will delete that and that. And let's see, where are we going? Here we go. All right. So let me ask you this. This is the first issue. This is KBCA's comment that the problems with mixed use poles, where can you talk me through it, whoever wants to, from KBCA? Like what are the problems that the attachers are facing with this, and how often is it a problem?
Hey, Jeb, I think Paul will probably take care of this, but in terms of this screen share, it looks like it's still on the IOU's comments on my screen.
Huh. Well, let me.
Oh, we got
I'm-
Jim.
Yeah, and I apologize. I don't know what happened. Whenever my passwords stop working, I assume that I've just been fired, but I don't think anybody else at the commission wants to do this. So bear with me while I kind of gather my wits and I can do some screen sharing. So be 1 minute. All right, let's see if it works this time around. Share. All right. Okay. All right, let's see. Now can people see this?
Yes, thanks, Jim.
Okay, thank
Yep.
you.
Got it.
My sincere apologies, but it would be worse if you were sitting next to the jackhammering, so we should be grateful for small miracles. Okay. So when it comes down here, I started to talk about the issue of transmission and distribution poles. And so could KBCA please elaborate on times, or let me ask you this, are these mixed use poles an issue right now? Or are they anticipated to be? So I look forward to any conversation from that.
Yeah, so maybe I can kick things off, and then our field pros can weigh in as well. But to answer your question, yes, this is an issue now. It's not, from our perspective, one that is controversial. The laws and the regulations around this are pretty clear, but in practice, it becomes muddled, and it can lead to confusion, delays, and controversies. And so in the process, when we apply, when poles are designated as containing transmission facilities, they often get kicked out of the application process and timelines and segregated when they really shouldn't, because these aren't just dedicated transmission poles. They are what we label in our comments, and what's generally understood in the industry as mixed use facilities. They have distribution as well as transmission. So from our perspective, it would be a helpful change, a helpful amendment to really clarify that these kinds of mixed use poles are subject to the traditional timelines that apply to inline distribution poles. And so I'll stop there and let others weigh in.
Paul, I can jump in. And to Paul's point is that what we want to eradicate is the confusion or question is that those mixed use poles be grouped in with the remainder of poles on all applications, so that they don't become a bottleneck or a stopgap in what is the collection of our ready to attach population, so that we can finalize construction and then obviously turn that finished construction back into the pole owner timely as well. But we are seeing time delays in terms of that segregation of transmission poles almost, or the mixed use poles with transmission going down kind of its own swim lane, if you will.
Okay. And so utilities, talk to me about this, please.
Well, Jeb, I'll lead off. The fact that there are distribution facilities on a transmission pole doesn't physically convert it from a transmission pole to a distribution pole. It is still a transmission pole. So the concern that we have with this is that the analysis of a transmission asset, whether it has distribution facilities on it or not, is inherently more time consuming and complicated, and actually goes to a different department. The further, like for LG&E and KU, their platform template that performs sort of the baseline pole loading analysis isn't set up for transmission assets, because they are analyzed on a case-by-case basis in a more detailed way, and understandably so. They're carrying much higher voltage electric lines. So I want to also go back to the way that the commission addressed this issue in the original rulemaking proceeding, because the utilities, at least LGE, KU, and Kentucky Power, and I think Duke Energy joined in this, had requested that transmission assets be categorically excluded from the regulation. And the commission's approach to that was to reject that proposed categorical exclusion, but to say that it would entertain exclusions within the tariffs filed by the individual utilities. And that's exactly what LGE, KU, and Kentucky Power did. And each of them treated transmission facilities differently within their tariff. So for example, in Kentucky Power's tariff, transmission facilities, any transmission pole is not included within the rights in the tariff. For both LGE and KU, transmission assets with distribution underbilled, so long as it's not 128 kV, are eligible for attachment, but are expressly excluded from the timelines applicable to distribution poles. And that simply reflects the point that I was making earlier about the exponential additional complexity involved in transmission poles. If the other approach that LG&E and KU, I suppose, could have taken is to exclude them all from the tariff, but they didn't. They were trying to facilitate access, but doing so in a way that reserved their rights to do the level of analysis required for these types of assets. So, Jason, have I accurately characterized that from the LG&E and KU perspective?
Yes, you did, Eric. I would just add to that it's not just the survey and engineering. The engineering portion is more complex, does use a completely different engineering software and tools, as you mentioned. But even beyond that, the construction component, this requires a whole nother level of qualified contractors, of actual equipment, and so on and so forth. So this is not, they just are not the same as a distribution pole in any way, shape, or form. We brought on a large number of contractors to support the high volume agreement that we have with Charter, and none of them are able to do transmission work, right? I mean, you have to go find a different skill set and a different contractor with additional equipment to perform that type of construction. So they're just completely a different category of pole and present an entire different set of risks to the grid as a whole.
So can I respond briefly?
So, yes,
Sorry,
you may.
this-
Then I've got two hands in a queue.
Sure. Just to be clear, we're talking about mixed-use poles, not transmission-only poles. Mixed-use poles have always been within the scope of the regulations. It's a matter on a practical basis of just ensuring that we have the same kind of efficient access to those that we normally do to any other distribution pole. And those kinds of mixed-use poles also are included within the rent. They're part of the rental formula. We pay rent on those poles. Those are poles to which we're just normally allowed and access to and have rights to attach to. So we're not talking about transmission only facilities, the kinds that Eric mentioned. We're talking about the mixed use type facilities that we really should and do have rights to access. And we just want to make sure that we don't get jammed up when we try to access those through the normal application process.
Okay. All right. So, Ms. Vaisman, you have your hand up.
Sure, thank you. I just want to say that we do generally, I think, would echo Mr. Langley's comments, LG&E and KU's comments, that just at a high level, we do believe that there are specific technical considerations and concerns with poles that are used for transmission, whether mixed use or not. And I think we'll set those out in more detail in our written comments.
Okay. All right. Appreciate that. So You never know when this computer's going to stop working. So let's just move on to the next thing. Red tag poles. One, as I understand, is to change the definition to mimic that of the FCC. And the other one is to have a notification requirement on that. So KBCA, could you talk to your proposals here?
Sure. I won't belabor the FCC point. As you know, that's something that we've been talking about in these proceedings for a very long time. But when it comes just in terms of the practical application of the commission's rules, we don't know when we're submitting applications whether we're dealing with polls that are properly red tagged or not. We get the make ready requests. We get notifications that polls need to be replaced. But where and how reg tag polls fit into that process just on a practical level is not transparent to us as attachers, and it should be. For the regulation to properly function the way it's intended by the commission, we need to know whether polls are quote unquote red tagged and how that fits into the amounts that we pay and make ready. And with that, I'll pause there and leave it to our field folks to correct me or later on.
Okay. Heather, do you have any, like, what, so, I mean, is this a transparency issue just in terms of pricing, or is it a functional issue in terms of planning out your deployment? Like,
It's more
why
from
the
a
necessity for additional?
Yeah, it's more just to ensure that we've got the proper plan up front from an execution standpoint.
Well,
So
I think the rules.
Go ahead, Mr. Langley.
I think the rule that KBCA is proposing, though, is identifying red tag polls that were on an application. So, I mean, that wouldn't correspond to the concern that Heather raised about planning. But on the transparency issue, I mean, one of the things that we just don't understand, and maybe there's a simple answer for this, is how they don't already know this. I mean, presumably they've ridden the line, they've looked at the polls, and they'll see if there's a tag, and they're not always red. I mean, there's a legend for what types of tags mean that the poll has been identified for replacement. So this is information that they actually, to Heather's point, should already have in their planning purposes as a result of the write out.
So, but I mean, that's as a practical thing. Are we talking, Mr. Warner, are we talking about let me ask you this. So a survey is done, you get the estimate, and it comes back to the attacher and says, this is the work that needs to be done. And by the way, there's pole replacements along the way. Is it at that point, it doesn't define whether or not it's a red tag pole that has to be replaced, or?
Right.
I'm just trying to figure out what the concern is.
Yes, I believe that's right. And I'll defer to Heather who can add to this, but I don't believe that we have any idea or any way of understanding whether a given poll is red tagged or not when we do our write outs.
Right, because we're not doing the upfront survey, right? So that upfront survey isn't a poll by poll look that would identify that on the front end.
Okay, all right.
The other thing, just to go back to what Mr. Langley was saying, that it may not be the case that the attacher is the one doing the survey, in which case the attacher would be wholly dependent on utility to identify red tag polls.
Okay.
This is Jason Jones. If I could jump in here real quick for LG&E and KU.
Yeah.
There is a point in the process at which those are identified and communicated. So they are tagged in the field, and if any sort of walkout or pre-design or survey or whatever we want to call this is done by the attacher, they can see it there. Or when we perform the surveys and do the engineering, we hold something called a virtual write-out, where all the parties that are attached to any individual poll are invited to attend, including the attacher, to discuss the make-ready solution. And in that solution, it is noted in there if that is a red tagged poll and one that will be the responsibility of the utility to replace versus something that will be billed to the attacher. So there is a notice that happens there in our process. in a communication.
Okay.
And I would add that prior to that virtual
All right.
write-out taking place, the photos that we collect in the course of the survey process.
So there are photos of all the polls.
Yes.
I think okay. All right. Okay. Well, once again, written comments on these things or written responses. Moving on, I think we talked about the next thing, which is let's see here. Is this hold on. So what is the concern about requiring the certification?
Yeah. So I think
Go
our
ahead.
concern with the certification form is it's essentially additional red tape without added value. So without added value, meaning that we strive to comply with the regulations and tariffs regardless of whether that's there or not. And the main reason for that, I mean, we don't want applications being kicked back as incomplete. And so it just adds this extra layer of burden. They're sometimes difficult to find. I mean, I know to their credit, KU and I presumably LG&E, but I saw in KU's tariff that they have the exact URL to go to their main page that has these forms and guidelines. But in terms of looking for others and some of the co-ops, it was, very piecemeal what I could find. Sometimes I could find a web page, sometimes I couldn't. Sometimes I found the page that had a certification form but no guidelines, or guidelines and no certification form. And as I understand it, that these forms are not on Catapult or All Been One. So it's just, difficult to find, and they're in slightly different forms. So if there is no added value, then why put this extra red tape in place? Or if it is something that needs to be there, then give it value. So if the poll attacher signs off on the certification form, then skip the poll and a review and go straight to a survey timeline would be our perspective.
All right. Well, utilities, do you think that yeah, I was about to ask Mr. Langley, what do you have to say?
I mean, we don't think there's a whole lot of value in this requirement, and we didn't when the commission was considering it as part of the emergency reg. So, I mean, from the perspective of LGE, KU, and Kentucky Power, we would be fine with KBCA's suggestion to delete it.
Any objections from anybody else? Because
This is,
all right.
This was the cooperative's original proposal on this. And
Mhm.
of course, the goal of it was to encourage better accuracy and completeness of the surveys and things that are being submitted. I don't know, given the lack of volume that we've seen in terms of attachment movement, that we're at a point to be able to assess whether it's been effective. But the idea of calling attention to the importance of the accuracy and completeness persists, and we would like to see it continue. It's not as big an issue as the payment issues, but I do think it's still important because we do sometimes still struggle with getting accurate and complete information.
Okay, but I mean, at that point, isn't it just if it's not accurate or complete, then the application itself is not deemed complete. Is that? I mean, I think Mr. Oslo hit it. Yeah,
that would be true, but hopefully the idea of having to certify that attaches importance to the notion that the data submitted needs to be accurate, so that we can cut down on corrected things.
All right.
And I think just going back to our point is that we're going to do that regardless to comply with regulations and tariffs. So it's just an unnecessary step.
Well, here's just thinking out loud. What if the reg said something like the submittal of an application shall be deemed a certification that the applicant has read and understood all of it, rather than having some separate form that says that? I think that might have been Todd's original point, and the suggestion that I'm just spitballing right now might address Tip's valid concern as well.
Yeah, I think that's a thought that we'll make into our comments on that. Again, our goal is accuracy and completeness.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. I appreciate that. Let's see here. I'll move on to the next thing. Overlashing, we already talked about that. So, all right. So now we're talking about the completeness review. So we're talking about 3 weeks. So what is KBCA's proposal here? Just talk me through it. I think I can understand it.
Yeah, just briefly, we think that timeline it should be shortened. There's never been really any evidence during the course of any of these hearings for the 10 days. We don't think it should take up to or for longer than 10 days, and we don't think that it really should take that long. And so we think there should just be a fixed time period of 10 days for all those applications simply to determine completeness. And of course, if there's a certification that it's complete, there really shouldn't be any added time around just determining whether an application is complete or not.
Okay. Utilities, what say you?
I think it's a function of quantity. Go ahead, Tip. Were you about to talk?
I was just going to say it kind of piggybacks on the thing we were just talking about, because part of that process determining whether it's accurate and complete. I just, particularly in light of the filing that was made the other day about the volume of things that are coming, I just don't see any realistic scenario why, in present experience or anticipated future experience, we need to be shortening those timeframes. What we've got is adequate. I don't think it's been a problem on the ground to date. And so the proposal sort of seems to me to kind of rehash what we spent the past 3 years looking at. I think we go with what we've got and see how it works, and we'll have to sort it out at that point once we have better experience.
Okay. All right. Move on. We'll talk about the resubmitted applications. And so go ahead, Mr. Warner, or whomever would like to tackle this issue.
Yeah, sure. I think it's largely self-explanatory. This is, again, something we've discussed before, but we do think that there should be a clear, explicit, defined timeline for re-review of a submitted application that's addressed a specific error. And so just to keep the process moving, we think there should be a specific deadline there.
Okay. And utility, I mean, I guess it does leave it kind of open-ended. It's when, because you get a resubmitted application and there is no timeline governing it. Would some sort of timeline, I'm not suggesting 5 business days or whatever, but would that, what burdens would that put on the utility necessarily to have a certain amount of time to respond to a resubmitted application?
Well, Jeb, I think we were under the impression that the 10-day deadline applied, and it might be the case that some clarity around that is warranted. Excuse me. We don't think it should be shorter than the original 10-day completeness review, because the need for time really turns on the level of incompleteness. And so just hypothetically, if there are 5 things that are supposed to be there, but for whatever case 4 of them are missing, well, it doesn't make sense for us to only have half the time to review upon resubmittal. 10 days is not very long anyway. So, I mean, we think we wouldn't object to there being a clarification that the 10-day period applies to review the resubmittal, but we would not endorse a 5-day period for the reasons I just set forward.
And the cooperatives would echo that as well. It's not as if once it gets resubmitted, you just pick right back up where you left off. It's in some respects still a new application.
But it shouldn't be the full period, because the re-review would just be the specifically identified error in the prior submission. It's not a re-review for completeness of the entire application. So it shouldn't take, reasonably the same amount of time as reviewing an entire application for completeness. And again, we're just talking about whether an application is complete or not at this stage, which is a relatively straightforward exercise.
Yeah, I don't think it's always the case.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Jeremy.
I was going to say, I disagree with Paul in the aspect of when you have somebody going through hundreds of these every week, if not more, you lose track of where permit 1 came in, and then it's resubmitted, and you got to go look back at the history and everything, and what was done, what was needed to be changed. So it's almost like it is a new application, because you are reviewing it all over again to see what was changed and if it does meet the current guidelines. So at least it's my thought.
Okay. All right. Well, let's keep on moving on. And like I said, we can get some written responses to these things. And I think that we've plowed some of this ground before in terms of the times for survey time and make ready time in the original one. So it's safe to say just either revert back to the original regulation timelines, Mr. Warner or KBCA, or just simply adopt those of the FCC. Would that be a fair characterization of the KBCA's position?
Yes.
Okay. Not trying to put words in people's mouths, but I think we have talked about this before. So just the last thing on here that I think we have not discussed are the special contracts. So in the lieu of a special contract or anything exceeding the 3,000 poll limit, what would KBCA suggest governs?
The regular large volume requirements. Our view is just that, and we've said this before, but just to reiterate, the special contracts really should be the exception, not the rule, and there should be clear rules that govern and where parties do not have a separate special contract.
So if it exceeds the 3,000 polls or the 3% and there's no contract, then what rules do apply then? I guess that's my question.
Well, I think we've addressed this before. Either there should be additional regulations or the cap should be removed around the large volume agreements.
Okay.
But perhaps our field folks have other comments.
All right. Well, that's we're going to address that in times. I'm going to move on to the updates. The reason I'm doing this is that I think that on our calendar at the PSC, this is reserved in teams through 1 p.m. and I don't know what happens if we exceed that, and I don't want to all of a sudden have everybody disappear without discussing these issues. Can people see what I brought up on the screen, the broadband deployment updates?
Yes.
We can, Mr. Penny.
Huzzah. Okay. So the first is KU. Let me ask you this, just in general, is there positive progress in the processing of these applications?
There is, from Charter's perspective, Mr. Penny and team, in terms of the partnership with KU. We are currently working with KU on kind of our findings and just experience really of the first 6 months of our high volume agreement and what potential outputs and or timelines might need to change so that we are successful in the execution of round 1 for next year, and then obviously round 2 and beyond that. So we've got an open, I would call it, handful of items that we're working through now that we've got a good 6 months worth of run rate behind us.
Okay. All right. And so when you talk about revising timelines, that's all within the context of the special contract, the high volume contract.
Correct.
Okay.
And I welcome KU to chime in on any of that as well.
Yeah, I don't see any hands up, but Mr. Lafayette or Mr. Jones, do you have any comments on the operation of this here?
No, I'll echo Heather's comments. I think it's working well, and as she mentioned, we've got a handful of items we're working through to probably make some changes to the high volume agreement.
Okay, all righty. And then we come to the cooperatives, and I appreciate everybody getting these in because at the end of the month, I will have to submit a quarterly report. The commission submits a quarterly report to the LRC, and I will be including these updates as attachments to the report, so that the legislature will be able to take a look at this. And so when I'm looking at this, is there anything of particular to which we need to pay particular attention with the current polls in progress for the cooperatives?
I don't know if Charter wants to say anything on this or not, but from the cooperative perspective, we've had a lot of good cooperation on this process. I think if anything, this chart shows that we've been able to date to generally be able to keep up with stuff. And it's part of the reason why I think, looking back at the regulation discussion we just had, we don't need wholesale changes there. Anything that does get addressed would need to be surgical, because this data, the KU data, seems to show that parties are able to work things out as they are. But
Okay.
we thank Charter for their cooperation on this.
Okay. So going back, I'm thinking out loud here before we take a look at the next document, but with regard to these updates, do you think there's any value, like how often do you think would be beneficial to the commission to see this information? I mean, not like because, I'm not thinking that seeing this updated information like this on a monthly basis will provide the commission with a lot of particular insight, but do you think like a quarterly update for this information would be beneficial to the commission's understanding of the issues? The reason I'm asking is that I would probably recommend to the commission issue an order requiring quarterly updates or something along those lines with this information so that we can at least keep the legislature apprised of the progress of these attachments. Mr. Schwanek?
Yeah, I guess, Jeb, obviously we defer to your judgment here because part of the objective here is to provide value and transparency to you. I think that quarterly, sounds reasonable to us. There's obviously a fair amount of work that goes into this, right? So repeating this on a 30-day cycle, I think presents challenges, for all of us in terms of
Well, I don't want to look at it on the 30-day cycle either.
Yeah,
so I appreciate
yeah.
that. Yeah.
And so what I'm almost thinking is if you create some kind of a timeline that gives you an opportunity to review and follow up with us if you have questions, right? So if you're keying this to your quarterly reports, and let's say your report is due at the end of March, maybe you have us file this in February, right? So you give yourself and us time to follow up as necessary, right? Unless you feel like that lag time is problematic for a legislative report. But I think, filing this quarterly and kind of offsetting the timing slightly so we have an opportunity to provide input and address questions, I think would work for us.
Okay. All righty. That's kind of what I was thinking. I govern by crisis. So if it's anything that's, looming, that's when I start to think about it. So I appreciate that recommendation. It'll help. Any of the utilities, have different thoughts than that?
I think those are good suggestions, Mr. Chwanish. Maybe we'd support that.
All right. We're all agreeing on an issue. So let's go on to the next shared screen, see if I can pull it up. It's not that, but it is. All right, can everybody see this document? It's the Outlook, projected network expansion outlook.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So talk to me, what is this document?
So Jeb, and I'll carry this and some folks can help with Q&A as needed. So as we've been having conversations over the last few months, I think you and the commissioners have kind of been trying to wrap your head around what's happened, what is happening, and kind of what the future holds. And so what we attempted to do here, and let me just make two general comments about format and presentation. We intentionally did not key this to polls because we don't want to create like another data stream that confuses or complicates what we're otherwise filing with you, right? That was number one. Number two is this is a little vague because I think there's competitive sensitivities here, right, to some of these numbers. So we were trying to give you, general numbers, right, in terms of the bar charts, right, because of that competitive sensitivity. So you have a sense of scale and trend, right, as opposed to giving you a precise number, right? And so what we're capturing here is locations activated, right, or customers that had service turned on, and the green and the blue represent charters activity, right, which is obviously a portion of what's happening in Kentucky, but not all of it. And then red is recognizing the potential associated with all providers, right? And that's associated with BEAD, and that is obviously still an open question, right? But we do know certain things about locations. We do know certain things about funding and timing, right? And so you can kind of have some general projection on what that volume is going to look like and what time frame is going to govern it.
Okay. And so on the left-hand side over here, the 180 down to 30,000, are those just customers, those just connections, not poles that you said?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
And listen, we can, I think we came up with, we went through several permutations of this, right? And, you know, you could turn this into 5 slides if you wanted to, right? But we were trying to kind of capture a sense of volume and timing and trend lines, and make it, you know, more easy and digestible, right?
Oh, okay. All right. So
what you then see, yeah, so Jeb, what you then see, just to add a little bit more color, and sorry, I'll let you do questions, is if you look at the last 3 years, you know, we've been at X. You then have that X, you know, doubling or multiplying, and then you have, right, the red that eventually starts to build on top of that at the back end. So I think, you know, I think what that sensitizes all of us to is that what we're experiencing now wasn't a tidal wave that's going to wash out in 12 months. If anything, it represents, you know, a steep line that is going up and that is going to be, you know, sustained, you know, I guess fortunately, you know, for 5+ years, right? The fortunately is that we're getting broadband to customers who need broadband, right? Obviously, there's a lot of work to do, but the end result from a policy perspective is very positive.
Okay. And so when I'm looking down here, detail of the rural broadband projects, that does not include any, so it just says state grant round 1. Are we in the midst of that, I guess? The finishing up this project round 1?
Heather, you can speak to that.
I can, yeah. So we are in the midst of building round 1. Round 1 contractually is due at the end of 2025. Flighted dates based on different counties having different deadlines. Round 2 was just recently executed in the 4th quarter of 2024. And then will be due at the end of 2026. And that's probably more of the most recent applications that are being submitted.
Okay. All right. Commissioners, do you have any questions on this, or does anybody have any questions on this? Because I think I can digest this.
I don't have questions right now, Jeb. I think this has been really useful.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have questions. I think it just shows that there's a lot of work coming and what we need to.
I think that is an accurate representation. Anybody have any questions on this document, and or can I stop sharing? All right. There we go. Back to the full screen. So I mentioned the opportunity for the filing of replies to these filings. We're also heading into a time that is often busy with a lot of people missing work. I don't want to create a lot more work for people, but we have seen these things. Would a filing deadline of December 27th, that's 2 weeks from today, December 27th, maybe the Friday after that, whatever date that falls in January, would that be sufficient for you all to get your replies in? Because I think that might give the commission, that would be January 3rd, to file responses in the docket. That might give the commission time to analyze those and then to come back to the stakeholders here with the commission's proposed changes to the emergency amendments and the original regulation and like that. So does that seem unreasonable, the 3rd? Because if we go much later than that, it's not going to give the commission a lot of time to get the review, make any suggested edits to the regulation and the amended regulation, get it to you all for further comment, get it to the governor's office for review, then get it to the LRC as well. So, Mr. Schwanek.
I know this is probably going to raise people's blood pressure, but I would be inclined to suggest a more aggressive time frame. I quite frankly feel like we need to kind of sharpen our pencils here. And, you know, as we look at a response to the commission, you know, I don't think we're going to be making sweeping policy statements. I think we will attempt to be to use somebody's words earlier, surgical with our comments and with specific red lines, and potentially see if we can seek out some compromises, right? Like some of what happened today, Jeb, is, there were discussions about issues where maybe there is a middle ground. We were talking about make-ready payments, maybe there's a middle ground on that issue, right? So I don't know. I'm concerned about pushing something at you guys that then gives you a limited runway. So I'm sorry to say that from our perspective, but I would be inclined to do a tighter time frame.
Sorry, I'm muted because you can hear that my hounds are at the door, it seems like. All right, so what about December 27th for comments? And of course, if you all, off stage agree on proposed language and like that, you can submit that at any time. I apologize. There's a lot of wincing and people checking in their calendars, but I don't think it's going to be particularly onerous. Honestly, it doesn't appear, because a lot of this stuff has been discussed before. I just need a complete record so that I can make recommendations to the commissioners on this issue. So, barring any objections, the commission will issue an order with requesting responses by the 27th of December, and probably scheduling another meeting to discuss sometime in January, propose edits to the that incorporate or maybe not incorporate some of the suggested changes. That order will be coming next week, so we can take care of that. Can you all think of anything else to cover at this moment, or do you think we've said enough?
All right, is there going to be my apologies, is there another hearing or another meeting coming up after the first of the year that we have on schedule already?
It hasn't been scheduled, but I suggest that we have one. And my anticipation is that the commission will then present what it thinks will be the changes to the regulation and emergency amendments. And then we can at least discuss that amongst the stakeholders and before the commission finalizes it. Because for emergency because the way that this works is that I believe the emergency regulation expires February 25th. And so for that to not be stay in place, but be, for it to be effective, or at least something to be effective, except for the original regulation, an emergency regulation with an original regulation has to be filed before the 25th of February. And so that's the timeline we're working with. And so that's why I would want to have sometime in January, one more meeting where the commission would have already distributed its suggested changes to the amendment, so we can at least get stakeholder feedback from you all before we start the process of governor review and LRC review. So that's a long way of answering your question, Mr. Gibson. It's not scheduled yet, but it will be. How about that?
Thank you, Mr. Penny. Yes.
All right. There being nothing else for the good of the order, we're beating my 1 p.m. self-imposed deadline by 3 minutes. So I appreciate everybody making last-minute changes not to come to Kentucky or not to come to Frankfort. And you all take care, have happy holidays, and I look forward to seeing your comments on the 27th. All right. Thank you all very much.
Everyone, happy
Thank
holidays.
you.